In Leviticus chapter 11, the entire chapter is given over to explaining what types of animals are acceptable for consumption and which ones were forbidden to consume as food. In other words, the Bible begins to define what is food and what is not food. In this chapter, the language used, as is typical of most of the subjects dealt with in Leviticus, is clean and unclean. I'll tell you what the Hebrew words are in a moment. These concepts, however, don't really translate too well into the English vernacular. In fact, they don't translate too well into any other receptor language without compromising some of the rich meaning conveyed in the original Hebrew. For instance, in Leviticus 11:4-8, speaking of some of the earth-dwelling animals, we read these words, quote, "But you are not to eat those that only chew the cud or only have a separate hoof. For example, the camel, the coney, and the hare are unclean for you, because they chew the cud but don't have a separate hoof. While the pig is unclean for you, because although it has a separate and completely divided hoof, it doesn't chew the cud. You are not to eat meat from these or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you." End quote. Now, in every single instance, the original Hebrew word translated as unclean above, where I have it underlined in my commentary there, is the Hebrew word tameh. As already expressed, this word is rather difficult to render precisely into a receptor language. It really is a concept that the word is trying to express, and in that concept, many multiple words could be utilized to try and convey the concept. And so by singling out the word tameh and interpreting as the word unclean, we're not really capturing the full concept that the Hebrew is trying to convey. I'm not even sure that I could properly even convey it to you here in this podcast, but let's give it a stab, okay? The concept implied here can mean a wide variety of ideas, ranging from ritually unclean to physically unclean to spiritually unclean to even ethically unclean, all right? And that's according to the Brown, Driver, and Briggs definition that I just utilized earlier. Now, here in the pages of this text, we find in no uncertain terms the definition of what is food and what is not food. Why we misunderstand this, I don't know. We also find, as I should note, the counterpart to our peculiar word tameh. Here, in the passage above, if you see the underlined word there in the written commentary, clean, it is the Hebrew word tahor, which is translated as clean. So now we have tameh and tahor. Going back to our hermeneutic principle of context, these concepts of tameh and tahor, as outlined in Leviticus chapter 11, fall right in the middle of a series of chapters dealing with subjects the likes of consecration of Aharon and the sons as high priest in chapter 8, the details concerning sin offerings and sacrifices in chapter 9, the consequences of failing to establish a difference between holy and the holy and the unholy in chapter 10, and the beginnings of the rulings concerning unclean flesh known as leprosy in chapter 12. That's where we are in chapter 11 here, going all the way back to chapter 8 and going forward to chapter 12. That's where we're at, okay? That's the larger context of what these terms tameh and tahor are trying to convey. It is within this context that Hashem explains what is kosher and what is not kosher, and consequently what is food and what is not food. Are you catching it? Is God the God of the Gentiles? Surely he is. Is he not? That's what Paul says explicitly in Romans 3:29 and 30, I believe. Is God the God of the Gentiles? Surely he is. It stands to reason, therefore, that the paradigm was being set right here in the Tanakh, that there be one law for both the native-born as well as the stranger in matters pertaining to covenant privileges. One standard was to be established and agreed upon for all Israel, a standard she would be held accountable for to eventually share with the surrounding nation groups as well. I want you to look up Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 1 through 14. So, since all men share the same Creator, we can, therefore, conclude that these distinctions of holy and unholy are applicable for the surrounding nations as well as for Israel. I might add, as these surrounding nations enter into covenant with God and join Israel. Our God is exclusive. Our God is consistent.